Number 10, homosexual couples and domestic violence. Now this one and the next one are very important. And here it says, for more information, please see homosexual couples and domestic violence. So I went there. And it says, in regards to homosexual couples and domestic violence, studies indicate that as a whole, homosexual couples have higher rates of promiscuity than heterosexual couples. In addition, studies report that homosexual couples have significantly higher incidences of violent behavior, which will be covered shortly. These studies are not surprising at all, given what pathologists have said regarding the commonness and brutality of homosexual murders. Regarding studies regarding homosexual couples and violence, a recent study by the Canadian government regarding homosexual couples states that violence was twice as common among homosexual couples compared with heterosexual couples. According to the American College of Pediatricians, remember that name, who cite several studies, violence among homosexual couples is 2 to 3 times more common than among married heterosexual couples. In addition, the American College of Pediatricians states the following: homosexual partnerships are significantly more prone to dissolution than heterosexual marriages, with the average homosexual relationship lasting only 2 to 3 years. Now, off to the side on the upper right, it says, a study by the Canadian government states that violence was twice as common among homosexual couples compared with heterosexual couples. And that's where they have the reference number 1 listed. And basically, they make the same statement twice using 2 different reference listings, but the references are basically the same. And I'm showing you the reference here. It's basically it's the General Social Survey, Statistics Canada, Canada's National Statistic Agency, 2005. Okay. Now these first 2 links, the very first link is from Statistics Canada and is to Measuring Violence Against Women, Statistical Trends. And if you follow this link, you'll find this has been archived, but you can still get at it. And then the data is based on the 2004 General Survey. So basically, as I said, these 2 references cover the same material. Same-sex relationships are mentioned twice. Let's see what they say. On page 16, in this document, the term spouse and spousal refer to both marital and common law unions unless otherwise specified. The data from the 2004 General Social Survey on victimization related to spousal violence included a small number of same-sex spousal relationships. However, the numbers were too small to make statistically reliable estimates separately for women and men. On page 39, violence perpetrated in same-sex couples is an important area of study, but very little data exists to describe the extent or nature of the problem. The 2004 General Social Survey inquired about sexual orientation, and results showed that spousal violence was twice as common amongst homosexual couples compared with heterosexual couples, 15% and 7% respectively. It was not possible to calculate rates of spousal violence for male and female couples separately due to low sample sizes. Among the spousal violence cases that were dealt with by a subset of police agencies over a 10-year period, 2.5% involved same-sex couples, about 1/4, 28% were female couples, and 72% were male couples. Now I'm going to read to you from a different section that doesn't seem to have anything to do with this, but it does, and it's about violence against Aboriginal women. Family violence has been identified as one of the most important issues facing Aboriginal people in Canada. In the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, a number of factors that are linked to violence in the Aboriginal communities were identified. These factors include systemic discrimination against Aboriginal peoples, economic and social deprivation, alcohol and substance abuse, and the intergenerational cycle of violence. According to RCAP hearings, other factors contributing to the high levels of violence in Aboriginal communities include the breakdown of healthy family life resulting from residential school upbringing, racism against Aboriginal peoples, the impact of colonialism on traditional values and cultures, and overcrowded substandard housing. Now, in this section on Aboriginal women, you can see that they discuss factors that lead to what is a greater percentage of violence amongst Aboriginals versus non-Aboriginals. Aboriginals have specific problems in society that lead to the higher numbers. Homosexuals in this society also have factors that could lead to stress and violence, but no stress factors are mentioned in this report as they are for Aboriginals. There are two things to look at here. First, there is a small sample size, likely too small to draw definitive conclusions about. Second, the homosexual community faces stresses that the heterosexual community doesn't, such as discrimination, family rejection, religious hatred, and the fear of exposure in many cases. These things can lead to greater tension and violence between couples, just as is seen with Aboriginal populations. Difference in the problems population might face, including homosexuals, need to be taken into consideration when looking at something like violence. Nothing like that is discussed in this report, but remember they were dealing with a small sample size. So, they say again that, violence was twice as common amongst homosexual couples in the other reference, which is the actual data from 2004. As I mentioned, these are two basic same thing. So I've already covered this. And the third link is to the American College of Pediatricians site. The American College of Pediatricians is a group of only a few hundred individuals that was formed specifically to oppose gay rights. They are not a legitimate organization, and you can't believe in anything they say. One last point. The Canada data is one survey from one country. I'm sure the data is good, but one survey isn't definitive. Canada does this research periodically. I notice that Conservapedia doesn't mention that or include reference to other Canada surveys. Maybe earlier surveys don't talk about same-sex couples, but that should be noted. Canada is one country. What about other countries? Didn't Conservapedia look into research from other countries? I doubt it. In going through this entry, it became clear to me that they find and use what they need and don't look for or discard anything that might be contrary. 11. Homosexuality and murders. This is one of the worst associations here. I followed the link to their homosexuality and murder entry where I found Vernon J. Geberth, who is a former commander of Bronx Homicide for the New York City Police Department, stated in 1995 regarding homosexual murders that homosexual murders are relatively common, and these murders may involve male victims murdered by other males, or may involve female victims who are in some type of lesbian relationship, and they are murdered by another female. But let's look at their reference. It's to Serial Murder Investigation by Vernon J. Geberth. And to check the reference itself, here's what it says. Introduction. Homosexual homicides are relatively common and may involve male victims killed by other males, or female victims involved in some sort of lesbian relationship who are killed by another female. Homosexual-related homicide, like all sex-related homicides, include interpersonal violence-oriented disputes and assaults, killings that involve forced anal and oral sodomy, lust murders, and other acts of sexual perversion, and serial killings. This article will address the subject of homosexual serial killers. It should be noted that uncomplicated homosexual male and female relationships, as well as sexual orientation, are not the subject of this article. And the next heading is Homosexual Killers in the U.S. That's what this is about. If you actually read it, it is talking about how to investigate homosexual serial killers. You'll also notice the line, it should be noted that uncomplicated homosexual male and female relationships, as well as sexual orientation, are not the subject of this article. The author even emphasizes this by putting it in bold and italic. The Conservapedia article's statement, homosexual murders are relatively common, and these murders may involve male victims murdered by other males, etc., is taken out of context. It's also a direct quote from the article, yet it's not put into quotation marks. Way to go, Conservapedia. A number of the references they use in this section are unavailable to me, but I want to look at one more. Other forensic journals on homosexual murders and overkill. There have been a number of journal articles on the issue of homosexual murders and overkill. In 1996, the Forensic Journal, the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, published an article entitled Homicide in Homosexual Victims, a study of 67 cases from the Broward County, Florida Medical Examiner's Office, with special emphasis on overkill. The abstract for the journal article states, Forensic pathologists often state that homosexual homicides are more violent than those with heterosexual victims. Overkill or wounding far beyond that required to cause death is a frequently used descriptor of these deaths. We quantified the number and extent of injuries between homosexual and heterosexual homicide victims to determine whether one group suffered more violence than the other. Homosexual homicides are more violent than heterosexual homicides when one compares the mean number of injuries. So let's look at the abstract they reference. That's what it says. But see the line copied in Conservapedia. We quantify the number and extent of injuries between homosexual and heterosexual homicide victims to determine whether one group suffered more violence than the other. This is about homosexual victims, not homosexual perpetrators. All this does is show how it is likely that the extreme hatred that exists for male homosexuals in this country causes extreme violence against homosexuals. I think Conservapedia needs to read their sources more carefully and think about what they mean. Trying to tie homosexuality not only to murder, but especially to very violent murders is vile. Homosexuals murder, homosexuals get murdered. Heterosexuals murder, heterosexuals get murdered. Conservapedia fails again in their attempt to vilify homosexuals by taking whatever lying low route they can. Homosexuality and bestiality. No. This has one person who is saying that it wasn't his thing, but he didn't see what the big deal was if the animal didn't mind, and a supposed chant at a march in Madrid. The link is to a place called LifeSiteNews, which has right-to-life origins and says in part, LifeSiteNews.com understands that abortion, euthanasia, cloning, homosexuality, and all other moral life and family issues are all interconnected in an international conflict affecting all nations, even at the most local levels. LifeSiteNews attempts to provide its readers with the big picture and the most useful and up-to-date information on this conflict. I say suppose because there are no links to the original news story. We just have their report, and a search on bestiality on their site shows that they link it frequently to homosexuality. Not an unbiased source.